You are listening to Harmony Sermons at Harmony Church in Sumter, South Carolina. And we love the fact you decided to join in on listening to this sermon today. But we also realize that there is no substitute in connecting with others. If you have any questions about visiting church, or if we can connect you to a local church wherever you are, please visit us at harmonychurchsumter.com. Cheers, and let's begin.
Well, I'm a music guy. I love music. I love a lot of different kinds of music. I have a pretty eclectic taste in my music, and so I am not above listening to and really enjoying a really sappy love song. And I was thinking, there's so many great love songs out there. I was thinking the other day, I wonder what would objectively be considered the top 10 greatest love songs of all time. So I asked ChatGPT that very question, our little AI tool that we have available to us, and it came up with a pretty good list. I bet you could guess what some of the songs are. All You Need Is Love by the Beatles made the list. I Can't Help Falling in Love by Elvis made the list. At Last by Etta James was on there. That's a great song. This one might be in the running for the GOAT. Unchained Melody by the Righteous Brothers. That's a phenomenal song. Endless Love by Diana Ross. Lionel Richie was on there. Wonderful Tonight by Eric Clapton made the list. Now, I was telling Dell about this, and he was really disappointed. Not a single Taylor Swift song made the list. Now, what do you think ChatGPT put as the number one greatest love song of all time? I'll give you two options. Do you think it was I Will Always Love You by Whitney Houston or My Heart Will Go On by Celine Dion for the number one spot? What do you think? Whitney. Whitney got it. And I believe that is objectively the correct answer. That is a phenomenal song. Now, I think it was criminal that The Glory of Love by Peter Cetera, Karate Kid 2, anybody? That didn't make the list. Neither did Bryan Adams' Heaven, which is a phenomenal love song. That's a criminal offense that didn't make the list. Now, here's the point. The world sings endlessly about love, but God actually defines what love is. We're going to talk about that today. If you have a Bible or a phone with you, we're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. We've been working our way through the letter to the Corinthian church that the Apostle Paul wrote. Remember that Paul was one of the main leaders when the church was in its infancy. And we've been calling this series, Love is Greater Than Everything. And today we actually come to the exact passage that title comes from. If you remember the background here, the Apostle Paul was the one that had started this church in Corinth, but then he left to go do other ministry. And it wasn't long after that Paul had received word that this church had gotten very unhealthy in a lot of different ways. And so Paul wrote this church a letter to sort of honestly take them to task for a lot of the sinful junk that they had allowed in their church. And then he took the opportunity to instruct them about a bunch of different topics. So he's talked about marriage and singleness. He's talked about why it's so important for a local church to keep the mission of God on the forefront above our preferences. He's talked about all that stuff, and it's led him here to chapter 13, where he's going to say, you can get all that stuff right. You can have your mission be laser focused, your theology can be straight as a gun barrel, but Paul says, if you are not a loving person, if your church is not a loving church, it's all for nothing. Love really is greater than anything else, a love for God and a love for others. And friends, it's no different for us today. We hear love songs every day. We use the word love constantly, but that doesn't mean that we actually understand the biblical idea of love. And so what we're going to look at this morning is this: 3 non-negotiables about love in the Christian's life. Three absolutes, 3 truths that if you really want to be the type of Christian that is close to the heart of Jesus, and if we want to be the type of church that Jesus blesses and uses, then we're going to have to understand the necessity of love in our lives. So here's the first non-negotiable. No love equals no value. No love equals no value. Notice how Paul starts off here, chapter 13, verse 1. He says, if I speak human or angelic tongues, but do not have love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so that I can move mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. And if I give away all my possessions, and I give over my body in order to boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Now, remember that Paul is addressing a really gifted church. We talked about spiritual gifts last week. Remember that spiritual gifts are gifts that God gives to Christians to help build the church and glorify God. And Paul lists some varsity level gifts here. He says, if I speak human or angelic tongues, he says, if I have the gift of prophecy, like if I can perceive what the Holy Spirit wants to say in situations, and God frequently uses me to speak directly to people in ways that helps them and edifies them. He says, if I understand all mysteries, if I have special insight to God's Word, and I can understand really complicated theological realities. He says, if I have incredible faith, if I'm the type of person who's really generous, I hold very loosely to my possessions. He even says, if I give my body to be martyred for Jesus. I mean, these are some incredible gifts that some Christians have, but Paul says, if you don't have love, it's all for nothing. These are the type of gifts that any local church would kill to have. Any local church would absolutely love to have church members that are gifted in these ways. It would bring so much value to that church. But if that person has those gifts and yet they are not a loving person, there's no value to the gifts whatsoever. You become a useless Christian. Now, the question is, why would anybody do those things and use those gifts if they were not driven by a love for God or others? Well, some people use their gifts because they love to be praised, right? They love to be noticed. They love it when somebody says, wow, man, look at so-and-so. Look at how gifted they are. Man, I wish I had those gifts. I wish I had the type of talent and ability that they have. That seems to be what was going on in the Corinthian church. And Paul's like, y'all are so gifted. You're so impressive. You could be so valuable for Jesus. But because you are a bunch of unloving people, you are of no value to Jesus whatsoever. As a matter of fact, look at how he describes them. Verse 1, he says, a noisy gong or clanging cymbal. Now, when Paul uses that example, more than likely, he's thinking about some of the religious temples that existed in Corinth at that time. This was a part of their religious worship of their false gods. They would bang on gongs or cymbals to try and get their god's attention. All those impressive spiritual gifts that the Corinthians had that God could use were outshadowed by that really abrasive sound. Now that sound will get the attention of other people, but it will not profit them. It will not do them any good. No love equals no value. Did you notice that Paul said that twice in verses 2 and 3? He says, if I have all these gifts, but I don't have love, what? Paul says, I am nothing. Now, he's not talking about your personal value as a human being. He's saying if you have all these impressive gifts, but the gifts are not accompanied by you showing and demonstrating love in your life, you are of no value to God. God can't use you. God won't use you. So, friends, ask yourself the question. If the love that I currently show other people in my everyday life, in everyday situations, right? My boss, my coworker, the barista at Starbucks, the bank teller, if the love and the kindness that I show to people like that, if that disappeared, would my Christianity look much different than it does right now? Like, is it possible that I am living out my faith in such a way that, man, I am all about theology? And I think that my spiritual gifts are pretty impressive. But if the love that I show other people on a regular basis, if that were taken away, would I really look much different than I do right now? Beware of substituting religious activity and spiritual knowledge for actual ground level everyday love. Well, Paul goes on, gives us the second non-negotiable when it comes to love in the Christian life, and it's this: real love equals real change. Do you want to have an impact on people? Like, do you want to be the type of person that can be a force for good and change in other people's lives? Well, Paul says that is absolutely possible. Here's how he talks about it. Verse 4. He says, love is patient. Love is kind. Love does not envy, is not boastful, is not arrogant, is not rude, is not self-seeking, is not irritable, and does not keep a record of wrongs. Love finds no joy in unrighteousness, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. You know, it's interesting that so much of the way that our world talks about love is as a feeling. But Paul gives us this big, long list here, and he doesn't talk about love as a feeling. He talks about it as a pattern of behavior. He says love is patient. Patient means that you expect others to not be perfect and you're okay with that. Right? I mean, like right out of the gate, Paul just kind of hits us right between the eyes. I have a whole lot of patience for my dysfunction. I don't always have a lot of patience for the dysfunction of others. Like, what if God was as impatient with you as you are with others? Then he says, love is kind. This means that you're considerate. It means that love considers others' needs instinctively. He says, love does not envy or boast. So what happens when that other person gets the house that you wanted, or the job that you wanted, or the boyfriend or the girlfriend that you wanted? Can you be okay with that? Can you not envy them for things like that? Parents, what is your attitude when somebody else's kids are doing well and yours aren't? Do you despise their blessing? Do you secretly wish that their kids would struggle too? Love doesn't do that. Love's not like that. Love rejoices in others' blessings even when you aren't experiencing them. He goes on to say that love isn't arrogant. So I'm not always thinking of myself first. I'm not always focused on my rights and my entitlements. Love isn't rude or self-seeking. Some scholars translate rude as dishonoring. I think that's what Paul has in mind here. Love doesn't dishonor a person by treating them like they're here for the fulfillment of your needs. Now, this next one stung me a little bit. Love is not irritable. That's a phrase that's really popular in 2026, right? That's triggering to me. Well, it turns out I'm actually pretty easily triggered. Recently, I was at an airport, and a security guard scolded me. Apparently, I was standing too close to an area that I wasn't supposed to be standing in, and she just kind of in this snotty tone just kind of scolded me. So do you know what I did? You know the first thing that came out of me? I gave it right back to her in the same snotty tone that she gave it to me in. Now, I've been a Christian for 40 years, and yet sometimes when it comes to basic level Christianity, that's where I'm at. Paul says love doesn't keep a record of wrongs. So when somebody hurts you or disappoints you, do you drag up all the previous ways that they've let you down? You don't get hysterical, you get historical, right? Like, you did this, and that connects to that previous time that you did that. And I remember back in 2009, one time, no, love doesn't do that. Love finds no joy in unrighteousness, but it rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. In other words, love never gives up hope for a person. Love never stops believing who this person could be and who God created them to be. Friends, this kind of real love equals real change. See, Paul is telling us here that love is seen best not in these like big monumental spiritual moments, but it's seen best in everyday normal situations. Right? Like tomorrow, you are going to be in about 50 different situations where you can choose to act in the ways that Paul just laid out here. It's funny to me that this is the passage that we choose to read at weddings. This is not remotely romantic, right? This is like professional level Christianity right here. If somebody read this to me at my wedding, that would be so discouraging to me because I'd be like, yeah, sorry, honey, I'll probably never love you perfectly like this. This is really difficult Christianity right here. Because who is Paul describing in these verses? He's describing Jesus. Right? Jesus is all these things. Jesus acts in all these ways. And that's why we say that real love equals real change. Jesus had the most powerfully effective change in people's lives more than anybody else. Right? He lived out and he embodied real love. I'm at the age where when it's my birthday or Christmas, I get dad gifts. You know what dad gifts are? Dad gifts are gifts that if you had received them when you were a younger man, you would probably be pretty disappointed. But now that you're like a middle-aged dad or an older dad, you're like, yes, this gift is awesome. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Beef jerky. That's a great dad gift. Okay? If I wake up on Christmas morning and I get beef jerky or meat sticks, that's a good Christmas for me. Another dad gift is a good, big, fancy bar of soap from TJ Maxx. I love that. That's an elite dad gift. Not body wash. That's a young man's game. I've moved back to bar soap. But I got a really great dad gift a while back. It's a shaving mirror for the shower. Now, I'm not using it a whole lot these days, but that's a solid gift. But I've noticed that over time, the mirror has gotten foggier and foggier. Like whatever they put on it to keep it from fogging up in the shower is wearing off and it's hard to use now. This passage right here is like a mirror for us. when you are not loving in all the normal ways of life that Paul has just laid out here, people seeing Jesus in you starts to get very, very foggy. And you have less of an impact on people, and you won't see nearly as much change in your own life. So do you know what would be a really good but probably really painful exercise? What if you reread this passage, but you replace the word love with your name? Dan is patient. Dan is kind. Dan does not envy. Dan is not boastful. Dan is not rude or self-seeking. Dan is not irritable. Dan keeps no record of wrongs. I mean, ouch, right? Friends, maybe ask yourself the question, what would love look like in my next conversation, or in my next conflict, or in my next big decision? Do I want to see real life change in my life and in others' life? Then I have to have real love. Well, Paul continues here in verse 8. He says, "For we know in part, and we prophesy in part." Here's the third non-negotiable about love in the Christian's life. True love equals true legacy. True love equals true legacy. Again, Paul goes back to these really impressive spiritual gifts that the Corinthians were so focused on and impressed by. The gift of prophecy and tongues and knowledge. And Paul says, as impressive as those gifts are, they have a shelf life. They're not going to last forever. How does he word it? He says prophecies will come to an end. Tongues will cease. Knowledge will come to an end. All those flashy gifts have an expiration date. They're temporary tools for this life. But what does he say about love? He says love never ends. Love outlives every gift and talent and platform and accomplishment. He goes on to say this in verse 9. "For we know in part, and we prophesy in part." In other words, even our best understanding right now is incomplete. We don't see everything clearly yet. We don't understand everything fully yet. But what is going to happen one day? Paul tells us, verse 10. He says, "But when the perfect comes, the partial will come to an end." What's he talking about there? Well, some Christians understand that verse a little differently. Some people think that verse is talking about the completion of the New Testament. So at the time that Paul was writing this letter, they did not have the completed scriptures yet. The New Testament was still being written. And so some Christians believe that when the Bible is completed, that'll be the end of some of those gifts. Other Christians look and say, well, I think that's referring to the return of Jesus. That when Jesus comes back, we're not going to need these gifts anymore. However you understand that verse to mean, the point is this: the gifts will not last forever, but love will. Love will never end, because if God is love and God can't end, then that means that love can't end either. The moment that we arrive in heaven is going to be the first time that we will experience perfect love. Not just a perfect love from God, but a perfect love for God and a perfect love for each other. And that's why he says in verse 13, "Now these three remain, faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love." The reason that love is the greatest is because love is the one virtue of those three that we're going to take to heaven with us. Right? Think about this. We're not going to need faith in heaven, because faith will become sight. You're going to be able to see firsthand all the things that you can't see right now that you have to have faith in. We're not going to need hope in heaven, because everything that we've been hoping for will be completely fulfilled in heaven. But love never ends. That there will be love in heaven. And so Paul goes on in verse 11 to say this: "When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put aside childish things." Now remember, the Corinthians were spiritually immature. Spiritually, they're acting like little kids. They were obsessed with gifts and status and being impressive. And Paul says, listen, that's baby stuff. That's little kid stuff. Maturity is not measured by how gifted you are. It's measured by how loving you are. Nobody is going to stand in heaven impressed with how eloquent you were on earth, or how smart you were, how gifted you were. Right? Like, nobody in heaven is going to be like, man, what a communicator he was. What a strategist she was on earth. No, they're not going to be talking about that. They're not going to remember that. But they will remember how you loved. Long after your abilities fade, love is what leaves a mark. Your legacy isn't going to be built on what you could do, but on how you treated people. And so Paul continues here in verse 12. He says, "For now we see only a reflection as in a mirror. but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I will know fully as I am fully known. Right now, everything's a little blurry. Right? Our perspective and our understanding and even our spiritual experience, they're like looking into that foggy mirror that we talked about. But one day we're going to see Jesus clearly, and when we do, the only thing that will truly matter isn't how much we knew or how much we did, but how much we loved. That's the kind of love that leaves a legacy. I don't know if you're a basketball fan or specifically an NBA fan, but there are a few things that have radically changed the game of basketball over the past 20 years or so. And one of those things is three-point shooting. So today it is totally common for a player to shoot three-point shots way behind the three-point line. I mean, NBA players are regularly shooting from almost half court and making those shots. And I believe that that is due in part to one player, Steph Curry. So Steph Curry plays for the Golden State Warriors. He is objectively the greatest shooter of all time. His insane shooting ability has left a mark on the game that when he retires, he will have left an incredible legacy on the game of basketball. The other night, Steph Curry was warming up before a game. He was shooting around, and he was shooting three-pointers. And he took a shot, a three-pointer, and he missed it. One of the trainers that was out there rebounding for him grabbed the ball and threw it back to him. He took another three-point shot, and he missed it. Now, that does not happen. Like in practice, when he's warming up, Steph Curry does not miss 2 shots in a row. So he walked up to the hoop, and he looked up at it, and he said, something's off with this. Something's not right with this basketball goal. So they got out a ladder, they put a measuring tape on the top of the rim, they dropped it to the floor, and sure enough, that basketball hoop was off by half an inch. Steph could just tell. He's so good at what he does that he could tell, even by half an inch, that the hoop was off. And what the Apostle Paul is telling us here is this: when the love in your life is even slightly off, everything else in your life starts to miss the mark. Friend, if you are at the point in your life where you're thinking about leaving a legacy, like it's really important to other people that you impact them and that other people know that you lived your life well, love is what you want to focus on. And so I want to ask the question, what does it look like to leave a legacy of love? Let me give you 5 ways, very briefly, for you to practically show love to others. And this first one is probably the toughest one for all of us, right? This is where we get really, really real. Be patient with difficult people. Be patient with difficult people. Everybody has difficult people in their life. And if you're sitting there thinking, I can't think of any difficult people I have in my life, then I hate to tell you, you're him. You're the difficult person, okay? Love stretches your patience, especially when somebody keeps pushing your buttons. Your boss, your coworker, your spouse, your kids, the person that you just have to interact with on a regular basis that you'd rather not interact with. Real legacy of love is built when you choose long-suffering over short-tempered reactions. Patience says, I'm not going to give up on you just because you're not easy. Secondly, refuse to keep emotional score. Love does not keep a running tally of wrongs. It doesn't rehearse the offense over and over and over and store it away for the next argument. When you keep score, every one of your relationships becomes a competition. Thirdly, speak truth without cruelty. Listen, it's okay to tell the truth. Right? Love tells the truth, even difficult truth, but it doesn't use truth like a weapon. There's a way to be right and still be wrong in how you say it. So your tone matters and your timing matters and for sure tenderness matters. The fourth way to leave a legacy of love is this: choose kindness when pride wants control. Right? Pride wants to win. Pride wants the last word. Pride wants to be seen as right. Love is willing to lower itself and humble itself for the sake of the relationship. And then number 5 is this: love people who cannot repay you. Hey, it's really easy to love people who can do something for you, right? It's easy to love people that give something back to you, that affirm you, that benefit you. But man, Jesus-shaped love moves toward people who have nothing to offer you in return. When you love the overlooked and the powerless, you are reflecting the heart of God. Now, we come to an end of a passage like this, and here's what I'm thinking as I've studied this all week. man, this sounds great. Like, this is beautiful. But this also sounds absolutely impossible. And friends, that's why we so desperately need the gospel. Because 1 Corinthians 13 is not just a description of how we should love. At its deepest level, this is a description of how Jesus loves us. I'm going to invite the band to come back up. And as they're coming up, I want to tell you about something that I read the other day that absolutely blew my mind. I was reading something about Elon Musk. You know who he is, right? He's the richest man in the world. He is so wealthy that the second richest person in the world is actually closer financially to you than they are to Elon Musk. Isn't that mind-blowing? So Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, Mark Zuckerberg, founder of Facebook, all those Saudi oil tycoons, as filthy rich as they are closer to you and me financially than they are to Elon Musk. Now, spiritually speaking, that's a pretty helpful picture. Because what that means is on our own, you and I are not just a little short of Jesus. We're not just a few steps behind Jesus. No, spiritually speaking, on our own, we are closer to the worst sinner in history than we are to the perfect holiness and love of Jesus Christ. That's sobering. And friends, that's why we need the gospel so desperately. Because the gospel tells us that when we place our faith in Jesus and we repent of our sin, we are given what we call the imputed righteousness of Christ. The imputed righteousness of Christ means that when you turn from your sin, and you turn from your self-sufficiency, and you turn from whatever it is that's keeping you from God, and you trust in Jesus for the very first time, God no longer relates to you on the basis of your imperfect love. He begins to relate to you on the basis of Jesus' perfect love. All right, think about this. Jesus lived a life of flawless patience and kindness and humility and sacrificial love that 1 Corinthians 13 describes. And at the cross, He took your sin and He paid for it, the penalty that you deserved, and He gave you His righteousness. So that when God looks at you, He does not see a record of all the ways that you've been impatient with people, or irritable toward people, or unloving toward people. Instead, He sees the perfect obedience and perfect love of His Son credited to your spiritual account. You are not accepted because you love so well. You are accepted by God because Jesus loved perfectly in your place. And that changes everything about how you love others. What that means is you are no longer trying to earn God's approval by being more loving. You become more loving because you already have His approval in Jesus. The security of being loved and fully forgiven, that frees your heart from pride and defensiveness and scorekeeping. When you realize how patient Jesus has been with you, you start to become more patient with others. When you remember how kind Jesus has been to you in your worst moments, that fuels your kindness in everyday moments with other people. So listen, the gospel doesn't just command love, it supplies the power for it. And the more that you rest in the reality that you are clothed in Christ's righteousness, and you are loved with Christ's love, the more that His love begins to overflow in you into the lives of the people around you. So friends, here's the question that I want to leave you with. Have you ever experienced God's love like this? Has there ever been a time in your life where you have said, God, I've been trying to do it on my own for far too long, and today I want to be done with that. God, today I trust You. I turn from my sin. God, You get to call the shots in my life. Has that ever happened? Friend, it can happen today. It can happen right now if you would turn from your sin and you would place your faith and trust in Jesus and what He accomplished for you. We'd love to talk with you about that. If that's something that you'd like to investigate more, you can talk to me afterwards or Pastor Dell. There's any number of people here that would love to explain that gospel more fully. So we're going to close our time together by asking for God's help with this, because this is one of those areas that we desperately need the Lord's help with. So let me invite you to stand as we sing together.